The morning sun rose over Redemption Creek like a judgment, harsh and unforgiving, casting long shadows across the wooden buildings that lined the single main street. Sarah Bennett stood at the edge of the crowd that had gathered in the town square, her hands clenched into fists inside the pockets of her worn dress, watching something that made her stomach turn with a mixture of rage and disbelief. In the center of the square, on a platform normally used for public announcements and celebrations, stood a man in chains, and the sight of him there felt like a violation of everything Sarah had been taught about dignity and honor. Running Wolf was his name, though the men conducting the auction refused to use it, referring to him only as the Apache or the Scout, or sometimes just the property. He was perhaps 30 years old, tall and lean with the bearing of someone who'd spent his life moving through landscapes most people feared. His face showed the marks of recent struggle, bruises darkening his jaw, and a cut above his eye that had bled and dried without proper care. But it was his eyes that held Sarah's attention, dark and distant, focused on something beyond the crowd, beyond the town, as if he'd removed himself mentally from the humiliation being inflicted on his body. Sarah knew Running Wolf, had known him for most of her life, in the complicated way that frontier children knew the people who moved between the settlement and the territories beyond. He'd served as scout and translator for the army fort 20 miles east, had helped negotiate peace agreements and prevent conflicts through his ability to understand both Apache and English, both indigenous customs and settler expectations. He'd been respected, trusted, considered an ally by the military commanders who depended on his knowledge to navigate the complex politics of a region where cultures collided daily. 3 months ago, everything had changed. A new Indian agent had arrived, a man named Hollister, who saw opportunity where others saw responsibility, who viewed his position not as public service, but as license to extract profit from people with no power to resist. Hollister had begun demanding payments from Apache groups for access to treaty-promised supplies, had sold government goods meant for indigenous families to private buyers, had systematically turned humanitarian assistance into extortion. When Running Wolf had reported these violations to the fort commander, documenting Hollister's corruption with careful detail, he'd made himself a threat that needed to be eliminated. The response had been swift and brutal. Hollister had used his connections with certain town officials, men who profited from his schemes, to have Running Wolf arrested on fabricated charges of theft and trespassing. The evidence was thin to non-existent, but the law in Kansas in 1868 was flexible when it came to indigenous people, especially those who made trouble for men with influence. Before the fort commander could intervene, before anyone could mount a legal defense, Hollister and his associates had arranged this auction, claiming the right to sell Running Wolf's labor to recover supposed debts and damages. Sarah had learned all this from her guardian, Mary Whitehorse, an Apache woman who'd taken Sarah in 6 years earlier, when fever had killed both her parents during their first winter in Kansas. Mary had connections throughout the indigenous communities, heard news that traveled through networks settlers didn't know existed, understood the political undercurrents that shaped frontier life. She'd explained to Sarah that what was happening to Running Wolf was part of a larger pattern, a systematic effort by corrupt officials to undermine any indigenous person who spoke against exploitation, to send a message that resistance would be crushed regardless of law or justice. The auction proceeded with obscene cheerfulness, the auctioneer calling out bids, as if this were a livestock sale rather than a human being's freedom. Several bidders participated, mostly ranch owners looking for cheap labor, men who saw an opportunity to acquire a skilled worker without the bother of fair wages or basic protections. The bids climbed slowly, and with each increase, Sarah felt something hardening inside her, a crystallization of anger into determination, of helpless witnessing into the need for action. She pushed through the crowd, ignoring the surprised looks and disapproving murmurs, making her way toward the platform, where Hollister stood overseeing the proceedings with obvious satisfaction. Sarah was 16, tall for her age but still obviously young, dressed in simple clothing that marked her as someone without wealth or status. Most people dismissed her immediately, assuming she was just a curious girl drawn by the spectacle. They didn't know that Mary had raised her with knowledge of both worlds, that she spoke Apache and understood customs and protocols that most settlers never learned, that she'd spent the last 6 years becoming part of a community that existed in the spaces between official recognition and complete. Invisibility. Sarah reached the platform's edge and called out to Hollister, her voice clear and loud enough to cut through the auctioneer's patter. She said that the auction was illegal, that Running Wolf was an army scout under military jurisdiction, that civilian authorities had no right to sell him regardless of any claimed debts. She cited the specific treaty provisions that protected indigenous people working for the government, demonstrated knowledge that surprised everyone, including Hollister, whose face went from smug satisfaction to cold anger in the space of seconds. The auctioneer stopped mid-sentence, uncertain how to proceed. The crowd's attention shifted from the platform to Sarah, curiosity mixing with disapproval. Our girl interrupting official business, a nobody challenging men with authority. It was entertainment, but also vaguely scandalous. Hollister recovered quickly, responding with patronizing dismissal, telling Sarah that legal matters were complex and not for children to question, suggesting she return to whatever work she should be doing instead of disrupting important proceedings. But Sarah didn't retreat. She'd spent 6 years learning that silence in the face of injustice was complicity, that speaking truth was sometimes the only weapon available to people without power. She explained louder now, addressing the crowd rather than just Hollister, that Running Wolf had reported corruption, that this auction was revenge disguised as law enforcement, that everyone watching was being made complicit in something that violated both legal standards and basic human decency. The effect was immediate and complicated. Some people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably, perhaps recognizing truth in Sarah's words, perhaps just embarrassed by the blunt naming of what everyone had chosen not to examine too closely. Others grew hostile, defensive in the way people become when their participation in wrongdoing is highlighted, when comfortable narratives are challenged by inconvenient facts. Hollister's expression hardened into something dangerous, the look of a man deciding that this interruption needed to be stopped permanently rather than just dismissed. Before the situation could escalate further, a new voice cut through the tension. A man stepped forward from the crowd, well-dressed and carrying himself with the confidence of someone used to being heard. He identified himself as Robert Caldwell, owner of the largest ranch in the county, and announced that he was bidding $500 for Running Wolf's labor contract, an amount far higher than any previous bid. The declaration effectively ended the auction, no one else willing or able to match that sum, and Hollister accepted immediately. Eager to conclude the sale before more complications could arise, Sarah watched in horror as money changed hands, as Running Wolf was transferred from public custody to private ownership, as the man she'd tried to save was led away in chains by Caldwell's ranch hands. She'd failed, had spoken up and accomplished nothing except making herself visible to people who'd prefer she stay silent. The crowd dispersed quickly, the entertainment over, leaving Sarah standing alone in the square as morning turned to afternoon, and the sun climbed higher in a sky that seemed to mock her helplessness with its clear, indifferent blue. But as she stood there, something Mary had taught her came back with new meaning. Mary had often said that immediate defeat wasn't the same as ultimate failure, that sometimes the first attempt just showed you what the real battle would require. Sarah had tried working within the system, had appealed to law and conscience, and discovered that neither carried weight when power had already decided on a course. So perhaps it was time to work outside the system, to seek help from sources the settlement didn't acknowledge or respect, to bring a different kind of pressure to bear on men who thought themselves untouchable. The idea that formed in Sarah's mind was audacious, bordering on reckless, the kind of plan that had almost no chance of succeeding and every chance of making everything worse. But doing nothing guaranteed Running Wolf would suffer whatever fate Caldwell had purchased him for, while trying at least offered possibility. Sarah turned away from the empty square and headed toward the edge of town, toward the prairie that stretched endlessly westward, toward communities and connections that existed beyond the boundaries of Redemption Creek's limited imagination. She had a journey to make and alliances to seek, and time was running against her with every hour that passed. Sarah left Redemption Creek before dawn the next morning, taking only what she could carry in a small pack and riding the old mare that Mary kept for trips between the settlement and the camps beyond. She'd spent the previous evening in intense conversation with Mary, explaining her plan and asking for guidance that Mary had provided with a mixture of pride and worry. The journey Sarah was undertaking would take her deep into territory that most settlers feared, where army patrols rarely ventured, and where indigenous communities maintained their own governance and justice systems far from American oversight. Mary had given Sarah more than just directions and supplies. She'd provided letters of introduction written in Apache, symbols and marks that would identify Sarah as someone under Mary's protection, as a person who'd been adopted into the web of relationships and obligations that structured indigenous society. She'd taught Sarah the proper protocols for approaching camps, the words and gestures that signaled peaceful intent, the stories Sarah should share to explain her mission. Most importantly, Mary had explained that what Sarah was asking for was enormous, that bringing warriors to Redemption Creek could trigger conflicts with devastating consequences for everyone involved. The ride west took 3 days of hard travel across prairie that seemed endless, grass rippling in wind that never stopped, sky stretching so vast it made Sarah feel simultaneously tiny and part of something immeasurably large. She rode carefully, watching for landmarks Mary had described, following creek beds and rock formations that served as navigation markers for people who knew how to read landscape like settlers read maps. At night, she camped in spots chosen for concealment rather than comfort, building small fires that produced minimal smoke, sleeping light and waking at every sound. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, Sarah found what she'd been seeking. The camp appeared gradually, teepees emerging from landscape in a way that made her realize she'd been observed for miles before being allowed to see. Warriors on horseback materialized from terrain that had seemed empty, surrounding Sarah with impressive speed, but without overt hostility, their presence more question than threat. Sarah stopped her mare, raised her hands in peaceful greeting, and spoke the Apache words Mary had taught her, identifying herself and requesting audience with the camp's leadership. The warriors conferred briefly in their own language, examining Mary's letters with careful attention, then gestured for Sarah to follow. They led her into camp, past families engaged in daily activities, who paused to watch the unusual sight of a young white girl being escorted through their community. Sarah kept her eyes forward but noticed everything: the organization of the camp, the mixture of traditional and traded goods, the children playing games that looked simultaneously foreign and familiar, the sense of ordered life that contradicted every settler story about savage chaos. She was brought to the largest teepee, where an older man waited with the bearing of someone whose authority was unquestioned. Through a translator, he introduced himself as Gray Eagle, leader of this band and uncle to Running Wolf. The revelation struck Sarah with force, the realization that she'd somehow found exactly the right community, that Mary's directions had led her to Running Wolf's own family. Gray Eagle's face was carefully controlled, showing no emotion as he listened to Sarah explain what had happened in Redemption Creek, why she'd made this journey, what she was asking them to do. The story took time to tell through translation, and Sarah found herself providing more context than she'd planned, explaining her own history, Mary's guardianship, her understanding of the corruption that had led to Running Wolf's capture. She described the auction with emotion she couldn't quite suppress: the humiliation of seeing a good man treated as property, the failure of law to protect someone who'd served both communities faithfully. When she finished, silence settled over the teepee, Gray Eagle considering her words with the weight they deserved. His response came slowly, through the translator, each word chosen carefully. He said that Running Wolf had been missing for weeks, that they'd searched but hadn't known where he was taken, that Sarah's information finally explained his disappearance. He thanked her for coming, for risking the journey to bring news, but his gratitude was complicated by obvious concern. He explained that what Sarah was asking, bringing warriors to a settler town, could easily escalate into violence that would hurt everyone, would give ammunition to those who wanted to drive indigenous people from Kansas entirely, would undermine the fragile peace that men like Running Wolf had worked years to build. Sarah understood these concerns, had anticipated them during her long ride, and now offered her counter-argument. She said that what had happened to Running Wolf was itself an act of war, a violation of treaties and trust that couldn't go unanswered without signaling that indigenous people could be exploited without consequence. She argued that a strong but peaceful demonstration might actually prevent future violence by showing that injustice wouldn't be tolerated silently, that communities were willing to stand together to protect their own. She admitted the risks, but emphasized that doing nothing carried its own dangers, that letting Running Wolf remain enslaved sent a message that was equally destructive. Grey Eagle listened, then asked questions that proved he was considering possibilities, rather than dismissing her proposal outright. He asked about the layout of Redemption Creek, about the number of armed men, about whether the army fort would intervene, about what Sarah thought could actually be accomplished, even if they did ride to the settlement. She answered as honestly as she could, admitting uncertainties while emphasizing that surprise and overwhelming numbers might create leverage for negotiation without requiring actual combat. The discussion continued as evening fell, other leaders joining the conversation, different perspectives and concerns being voiced and debated. Sarah sat through it all, exhausted from travel, but forcing herself to stay alert, to answer questions and provide information that helped them assess risks and possibilities. Gradually, a consensus began forming, not unanimous but strong enough to support action. They would ride to Redemption Creek, but not for conquest or revenge. They would come as a show of strength, designed to force negotiation, as undeniable presence that couldn't be ignored or dismissed, as family demanding the return of their own through channels that settlers might not recognize, but couldn't reasonably refuse. The plan that emerged was more sophisticated than Sarah had imagined. They wouldn't attack or threaten, would instead arrive with ceremonial formality, requesting counsel with town leadership to resolve Running Wolf's situation according to both Apache and American concepts of justice. The 300 warriors would serve as witnesses and guarantors, ensuring that negotiations happened in good faith rather than being dismissed or delayed. If the town agreed to release Running Wolf and address the corruption that had led to his capture, the warriors would leave peacefully. If the town refused, well, the implicit pressure of 300 mounted warriors would make refusal seem considerably less appealing than compromise. Grey Eagle assigned Sarah a guide for the return journey, a young warrior named Swift Arrow, who would help coordinate the timing and ensure she didn't get lost or encounter problems on the ride back. He also gave her a message to carry to Mary, thanks for raising Sarah with honor, and requesting Mary's presence at the coming council, since her voice would be needed to bridge languages and cultures. The gifts of trust being offered to Sarah felt enormous, the recognition that she'd been judged capable and worthy of responsibility in matters that would shape the future for many people. As Sarah prepared to leave the next morning, Swift Arrow beside her on his own horse, she felt the weight of what she'd set in motion. 300 warriors would follow her back to Redemption Creek, would risk themselves because she'd asked, because they trusted her connection to Mary and her story about injustice. The responsibility was crushing and energizing in equal measure. The knowledge that her choices now mattered in ways that affected not just Running Wolf, but entire communities balanced on the edge of conflict or cooperation. She'd wanted to help one person, and had instead become part of something much larger, much more complicated, and far more important than she'd understood when she first interrupted that auction. The ride back toward Redemption Creek took 2 days, Sarah and Swift Arrow moving faster now that she knew the route, pushing their horses with urgency, born from understanding that timing mattered. Behind them, at a pace calculated to arrive at the right moment, 300 warriors prepared to follow, gathering from multiple camps, coordinating through networks of communication that predated American occupation of Kansas by centuries. Sarah rode thinking about what awaited in Redemption Creek, how the settlement would react to seeing what most settlers only experienced in nightmares, whether her faith in peaceful resolution would prove justified or catastrophically naive. But she'd committed now, had chosen action over safety, and all that remained was to see her choice through to whatever conclusion awaited. The prairie stretched endlessly ahead, and somewhere at its edge, Running Wolf waited in chains, unaware that rescue was coming, in a form that would challenge everything both settlers and indigenous people thought they knew about power, justice, and the possibility of finding common ground in a divided land. Sarah and Swift Arrow reached the outskirts of Redemption Creek at sunset on the second day, positioning themselves in a grove of cottonwoods that offered cover while providing clear view of the settlement. The town looked peaceful in the fading light, smoke rising from chimneys, people moving through evening routines without awareness that anything unusual was approaching. Sarah felt the surreal disconnection of knowing what was coming while watching ordinary life continue oblivious, like standing on a shore seeing a wave building far out at sea, while people on the beach remained unaware of the water gathering to crash over them. Swift Arrow left her there, with instructions to wait until morning, when the warriors would arrive and formal approach would begin. He disappeared into the prairie with the ease of someone who moved through landscape as naturally as wind, riding back to guide the main group to their staging position. Sarah sat alone through the long night, too anxious to sleep, reviewing everything that had led to this moment and questioning whether she'd made terrible mistakes or necessary choices. By the time dawn broke, she'd cycled through doubt and determination so many times that both had worn smooth, leaving only acceptance of what was about to unfold. The warriors arrived as the sun cleared the horizon, appearing on the eastern ridge in a line that stretched impossibly wide. 300 mounted figures silhouetted against morning light in a sight both beautiful and terrifying. They came slowly, deliberately, their approach designed to be seen from distance. To give the settlement time to understand what was happening before arrival made retreat impossible. Sarah rode down from her position to meet Mary, who'd positioned herself at the front with Grey Eagle and other leaders, ready to serve as translator and mediator when the time came. Mary's expression was complex when she saw Sarah. Pride and worry and something else that might have been recognition that the girl she'd raised was becoming someone unexpected, someone who'd taken lessons about justice and translated them into actions, with consequences that rippled far beyond individual choices. She embraced Sarah briefly, then turned her attention back to the settlement below, where frantic activity had begun, as people spotted the approaching warriors and panic spread through streets that minutes before had been peaceful. Church bells began ringing in Redemption Creek, the alarm that signaled danger and summoned everyone to the town center. Men grabbed rifles and took positions behind buildings. Women gathered children and barricaded themselves in homes, the settlement transforming from sleepy frontier town into defensive position with the speed of practice born from years of living with threat. Sarah watched the transformation and felt sick, wondering if her plan would end in bloodshed. If her faith in peaceful resolution was about to be proven catastrophically wrong. Grey Eagle raised his hand, and the warrior line stopped just beyond rifle range, a distance calculated to demonstrate strength while not triggering immediate violence. He and Mary rode forward slowly, Sarah following behind, approaching the settlement with deliberate non-aggression, hands visible and empty of weapons. When they reached speaking distance from the barricaded center, Mary called out in English, identifying herself and requesting counsel with town, leadership to resolve a matter of justice and honor, according to proper protocols respected by both Apache and American law. The response came from Sheriff Morrison, a decent man who'd been uncomfortable with running Wolf's auction, but had lacked courage or authority to stop it. His voice carried across the tense space between armed positions, asking what this was about, why 300 warriors had appeared at their town, what demands were being made. Mary answered calmly, explaining that they'd come to request Running Wolf's release, that his capture and sale had violated treaties and human dignity, that they sought negotiation rather than conflict, but came with strength sufficient to ensure negotiations happened in good faith. Morrison looked uncertain, clearly aware that this situation exceeded his authority to resolve, that decisions needed to be made by people with more power and presumably more wisdom. He asked for time to gather town leadership, to convene a council that could discuss terms properly. Grey Eagle agreed through Mary's translation, saying they would wait until noon, would remain in position without advancing but also without leaving until the matter was addressed. The implicit message was clear. Time for talking was limited, but talking was still possible, and the choice between negotiation and confrontation belonged to Redemption Creek's leaders. The morning hours passed in excruciating tension, Sarah sitting with Mary and Grey Eagle in the open ground between the warrior line and the settlement, visible to both sides, vulnerable to both sides, holding space for resolution through presence that couldn't be ignored or dismissed. Behind the barricades, urgent discussions unfolded. Arguments about what to do, how to respond, whether to fight or negotiate, or try to send for help from the army fort that was hours away, and might not arrive in time even if summoned. Finally, as noon approached, a delegation emerged from the settlement. Sheriff Morrison, Mayor Collins, and surprisingly Robert Caldwell, the ranch owner who'd purchased Running Wolf at the auction. They approached slowly, clearly nervous but maintaining composure, and accepted Mary's invitation to sit in council circle, the traditional Apache format for important discussions where all parties could see each other clearly and speak with equal standing. Hollister was notably absent, and when Morrison mentioned him, the sheriff's expression suggested the corrupt Indian agent had made himself scarce rather than face accountability for his actions. Gray Eagle spoke first through Mary's translation, laying out the Apache perspective. Running Wolf was family, was respected member of their community, who'd served honorably as bridge between cultures, whose capture and sale was not only illegal under treaty provisions, but deeply insulting, according to indigenous customs regarding treatment of prisoners and resolution of disputes. He explained that they'd come not to make war, but to demand justice through demonstration that Running Wolf's family was strong, numerous and unwilling to accept his continued captivity. Morrison responded carefully, acknowledging that Running Wolf's treatment had troubled him, that the auction had proceeded over his objections, that he documented concerns with regional authorities, but hadn't been able to stop events before they occurred. He said that legally, Running Wolf was now Caldwell's property through legitimate purchase, that undoing the sale would require Caldwell's agreement or court intervention that could take months to resolve. The words were honest but unhelpful, legal truth that served power rather than justice. All eyes turned to Caldwell, the man whose decision could resolve or escalate the crisis. He sat silent for a long moment, examining the situation with the calculating gaze of someone used to assessing costs and benefits, risks and rewards. When he finally spoke, his words surprised everyone, including Sarah. He said he'd purchased Running Wolf not to exploit him, but to protect him, that he'd recognized Hollister's auction as revenge disguised as law, and had bid high to ensure no one worse gained control. He said he'd intended to release Running Wolf once the immediate danger passed, once Hollister's attention moved elsewhere, but events had moved faster than he'd anticipated. The revelation shifted the dynamic completely, transforming Caldwell from adversary to unexpected ally, from obstacle to potential solution. Gray Eagle asked through Mary why, if his intentions were honorable, Caldwell hadn't simply released Running Wolf immediately after purchase. Caldwell explained that doing so publicly would have exposed him to legal challenges from Hollister and his associates, would have invited retaliation against his ranch, but that he'd been searching for a safe method to resolve the situation without triggering consequences that would hurt everyone involved. Mary posed the obvious next question. Would Caldwell release Running Wolf now here, in front of witnesses from both communities who could testify to the legitimacy of the exchange? Caldwell considered, clearly weighing risks and possibilities, then nodded slowly. He said yes, he would release Running Wolf to his family, would provide written documentation releasing all claims, would testify if needed about Hollister's corruption and the illegal nature of the original auction. He asked only one thing in return, that Gray Eagle and his warriors leave peacefully, that this demonstration not become excuse for violence that would harm innocent people on both sides. Gray Eagle agreed immediately, recognizing that Caldwell was offering everything they'd come for, that accepting gracefully served Apache interests better than pushing for additional concessions or symbolic victories. He said they would depart as soon as Running Wolf was released, would return to their territories with honor satisfied and family restored, would remember Caldwell's integrity in future dealings between their peoples. The agreement was simple, direct, and sufficient. Resolution achieved through presence and pressure, and willingness to talk rather than fight. Caldwell sent riders to his ranch to bring Running Wolf back, a journey that would take several hours. During the wait, something unexpected happened. People from Redemption Creek began emerging from their defensive positions, curiosity overcoming fear. Approaching the council area to witness resolution rather than conflict, some brought food and water, offerings made with hesitant hospitality to warriors who'd arrived as threat but hadn't behaved as enemies. Mary facilitated careful interactions, translating conversations between settlers and warriors who discovered that fear dissolved somewhat when people actually talked to each other, rather than about each other. Sarah watched these small exchanges with amazement, seeing the possibility that this crisis might actually create understanding rather than deepening divisions, that 300 warriors arriving at Redemption Creek might become story told differently than everyone had expected. She thought about Running Wolf, about how his suffering had somehow catalyzed this moment, where two communities were forced to see each other clearly, to negotiate honestly, to find resolution that honored both perspectives. It wasn't perfect reconciliation, wasn't erasure of all the injustice and prejudice that made frontier life so difficult, but it was something, was small beginning that might grow if people chose to nurture it rather than retreating back into comfortable animosities. When Running Wolf finally arrived in late afternoon, still bearing marks of his ordeal, but walking free beside Caldwell's men, the moment felt almost anticlimactic, resolution so much quieter than the crisis that had preceded it. He looked stunned to see 300 warriors waiting, to see Grey Eagle and Mary and Sarah all together, to realize what had happened during his captivity. His reunion with family was emotional but controlled. Apache dignity containing feelings that ran too deep for public display, gratitude expressed through gestures and words that carried weight beyond their simple surface meaning. Caldwell formally released all claims, signing documents that Mary witnessed, creating record that would protect Running Wolf if anyone tried to recapture him using legal mechanisms. Grey Eagle thanked Caldwell with grave courtesy, acknowledging that not all settlers were enemies, that integrity existed in individuals even when systems failed. Then, as promised, the 300 warriors prepared to depart, mounting horses and reforming lines with the same deliberate grace they'd shown arriving. Demonstration that they'd come in strength and were leaving with dignity rather than being driven away in defeat. Before leaving, Grey Eagle spoke one final time through Mary, addressing the assembled townspeople who'd gathered to witness the conclusion of events that would be told and retold for years to come. He said that Running Wolf's capture and treatment had violated not just law but the trust that men like Running Wolf had worked years to build between peoples who shared this land, whether they liked it or not. He said that 300 warriors had come today peacefully, but next time injustice occurred, the response might not be so measured, might not offer opportunity for negotiation before action. He said that Redemption Creek had been given chance to prove that justice mattered more than power, and by releasing Running Wolf they'd proven it, but that proof needed to continue in future dealings, in daily choices about how people treated each other, across lines of difference and distrust. The words hung in the afternoon air, like challenge and promise mixed together. Reminder that today's resolution didn't erase larger tensions, didn't solve fundamental problems of two peoples competing for same resources in same space. But resolution was still better than violence, talking was still better than fighting, and maybe that was enough for now, enough to build on if people chose continuation rather than regression. As the warriors rode away into the prairie sunset, Sarah stood with Mary and Running Wolf watching them go, feeling exhausted and relieved and uncertain about what came next, but certain that she'd done something that mattered, had chosen action over silence, and somehow helped create outcome better than anyone had expected when this crisis began.